Welcome to what amounts to the second to the end of the taped versions of the show. We will continue doing it live at 3 on Fridays, but as far as the YouTube end of things, that will be coming to a glorious conclusion next week. Now, what we're going to do this week is something I've looked forward to. It is Margaret Atwood's Burning Questions. It's essays and occasional pieces, and without further ado, I'm going to leap into it. You will find wonderful points of view in this book, some of them short, some of them long. Here is one of the short ones that I found particularly apropos. What art under Trump? This was done in 2017. Of what use is art? Well, that's a question often asked in societies where money is the prime measure of worth, usually by people who do not understand art, and therefore dislike it and the artists who make it. Now, however, the question is being posed by artists themselves. For American writers and other artists, there's a distinct chill in the air. Strong men have a well-earned reputation for suppression and for demanding fawning tributes. Suck up or shut up has been their rule. During the Cold War, many writers, filmmakers, and playwrights received visits from the FBI on suspicion of un-American activities. Will that history be repeated? Will self-censorship set in? Could we be entering an age of Samadat in the United States with manuscripts circulating secretly because publishing them would mean inviting reprisal? Now that sounds extreme, but considering Americans' own history and the wave of authoritarian governments sweeping the globe, it's not out of the question. In the face of such uncertainties and fears, the creative communities of the United States are nervously urging one another not to surrender without a fight. Don't give up. Write your book. Make your art. But what art to make? 50 years from now, what will be said about the art and writing of this era? Now, the Great Depression was immortalized by John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, which described in detail what the Dust Bowl years felt like to those living through them at the lowest level of American society. Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, provided an apt metaphor for McCarthyism, with its witch hunts and mass accusations. Klaus Mann's 1936 novel, Mephisto, about the rise of a famous actor, showed absolute power corrupting an artist absolutely. A fitting story during the reign of Hitler. What sorts of novels, poems, films, television series, video games, paintings, music, or graphic novels will adequately reflect America's next decade? Now, we don't have any idea yet. We can't. Nothing is predictable except unpredictability. It's probably fair to say, however, that Donald Trump's interest in the arts, gauged on a scale from 1 to 10, is somewhere between 0 and -10, lower than any president in the past 50 years. Some of those presidents didn't give a hoot about the arts, but at least they found it politic to pretend. Trump won't. In fact, he may not even notice that they're there. This might, in fact, work to our advantage. Stalin and Hitler took an interest in the arts and considered themselves experts. and arbiters, which was very bad news for the writers and artists whose styles displeased the authorities. These got packed off to the gulag or condemned as degenerate. Now, hopefully, most creative people will find themselves flying under the radar, so insignificant as to escape detection. The United States has no gulags. It prefers to express displeasure through behind-the-scenes blackballing. The screenwriter's phone doesn't ring, as it did for the Hollywood 10. The musician's songs go unplayed, as Buffy St. Marie's were during the Vietnam War, because her song, Universal Soldier, the writer's book fails to find a publisher, as was the case for many years with Marilyn French's From Eve to Dawn, a history of women in the world. A change in the overall cultural climate may well be expected, with rewards of various kinds flowing to those willing to ride along in the wake of the incumbent powerboat, and quiet punishments meted out to those who refuse. Those reprisals may take the form of noxious, POTUS tweets, like the recent one which Trump kicked his celebrity apprentice successor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, right in the ratings, or vulgar public denunciations, like his dismissal of Meryl Streep after her Golden Globe speech, implicitly criticized Trump as a bully. And what will happen to freedom of speech, that hallmark of American democracy? Will the very idea become a euphemism for hate speech and internet bullying, a hammer to whack political correctness? That has already begun. If it intensifies, will those defending the concept of free speech then be attacked from the left as collaborators with fascists? Surely we can look to the artists to uphold our better values. Don't they represent the most noble features of the human spirit? Not necessarily. Creative people come in many makes and models. Some are merely paid entertainers, opportunists out to make $1 million. Some have more sinister agendas. There's nothing inherently sacred about films and pictures and writers and books. Mein Kampf was a book. Plenty of creative people in the past have rolled over for the powerful. In fact, they're especially subject to authoritarian pressures because, as isolated individuals, they're very easy to pick off. No armed militia of painters protects them. No underground mafia of screenwriters will put a horse's head in your bed if you cross them. Those under attack may be defended verbally by other artists, but such defense counts for little if a ruthless establishment is bent on their destruction. The pen is mightier than the sword, but only in retrospect. At the time of combat, those with the swords generally win. But this is America. It has a long and honorable history of resistance, and its multi-voice and multifaceted variety will itself be some defense. There will, of course, be protest movements, and artists and writers will be urged to join them. It will be their moral duty, or so they will be told, to lend their voices to the cause. Artists are always being lectured on their moral duty, a fate other professionals, dentists, for example, generally avoid. But it's tricky telling creative people what to create, or demanding that their art serve a higher-minded agenda crafted by others. Those among them who follow such hortatory instructions are likely to produce, well, mere propaganda or two-dimensional allegory. Tedious sermonizing either way. The art galleries of the mediocre are wallpapered with good intentions. What then? What sort of genuine artistic response might be possible? Maybe social satire. Perhaps someone will attempt the equivalent of Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, which suggested the consumption of babies as an economic solution to Irish poverty. But satire, alas, tends to fall flat when reality exceeds even the wildest exaggerations of the imagination, as it is increasingly doing today. Now, science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction have often been used to register protest in times of political pressure. They've told the truth, but told it slant, as Zamyatin did in his 1924 novel, We, which anticipated the Soviet repressions to come. Many American writers took to science fiction in the McCarthy years because it allowed them to criticize their society without being too easily spotted by the powers intent on quashing criticism. Some will produce witness art, like those artists who have responded to great catastrophes, wars, earthquakes, genocides. Surely the journal keepers are already at work, inscribing events and their responses to them, like those who kept accounts of the Black Death until they themselves succumbed to it. Or like Anne Frank, writing in her diary from her attic hiding place. Or like Samuel Pepys, who wrote down what happened during the Great Fire of London. Works of simple witnessing can be intensely powerful, like Sawadi's memoirs from the women's prison about her time behind bars in Anwar Sadat's Egypt, or Ian Lianki's The Four Books, which chronicles the famines and mass deaths in China during the Great Leap Forward. American artists and writers have seldom been shy about exploring the fissures and cracks in their own country. Let's hope that if democracy implodes and free speech is suppressed, someone will record the process as it unfolds. In the short run, perhaps all we can expect from artists is only what we have always expected. As once solid certainties crumble, it may be enough to cultivate your own artistic garden, to do what you can as well as you can, for as long as you can do it, to create alternate worlds that offer both temporary escapes and moments of insight, to open windows in the given world that allow us to see outside it. With the Trump era upon us, it's the artists and writers who can remind us in times of crisis or panic that each of us is more than just a vote, a statistic. Lives may be deformed by politics, and many certainly have been, but we are not finally the sum of our politicians. Throughout history, it has been hope for artistic work that expresses, for this time and place, as powerfully and eloquently as possible, what it is to be human. And so state Margaret Atwood's ruminations on the arts. Now, just a little sidebar. There was a quote in there, and now let me see if I can find it, that some of you who are avid readers will probably remember. Where is it? You can never find things when you're looking for them. But it is a quote. It was a quote from Emily Dickinson, and if I find it, I'll tell you about it next week. But right now, it's floating in front of my eyes, and I can't quite pin it down. Nope. I'll have to tell you next week. But it's wonderful the way she just went from the various poets and novelists and essayists and cherry-picked from all of them little bits of wisdom that she cobbled together. Now, there's somebody you all know. It's part of our culture. Scrooge. This she wrote in 2009. And I'll read as much of this as I can get through in our allotted time. Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in 1843. He was already very famous, having made his name with the Pickwick Papers and then enhanced it with Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, and the Old Curiosity Shop. Oh, and Barnaby Rudge. And all this before he was 30. This pace was prodigious. No writer alive has written at such a pace and produced such high-quality work at such a young age. Dickens is said to have written A Christmas Carol in 6 weeks. Oh, to pay off a debt. Perhaps that was why grasping money-lenders were so much in his mind, and he presented this novella as a light-hearted jeu d'esprit, a Christmas fairy tale or ghost tale, intended to entertain and to put his readers in good humor. The story has the traditional 3-part structure of a fairy tale. 3 spirits of Christmas, 3 ages of Scrooge, past, present, future, and it also has a fairy tale ending in which light triumphs over darkness. Goodness and harmony reign, and an innocent life in peril, Tiny Tim's, is saved, not to mention the gnarly old soul of Scrooge. Dickens' more covert intention, signaled by the work's one-time working title, The Sledgehammer, was to strike a few more blows for the social justice he was so keen on contrasting avarice and poverty, then proposing his usual antidote, an outflowing of private benevolence. For, as George Orwell has commented, though Dickens burned with anger at social injustices, he never went so far as to urge a whole-scale political revolution. But none of this would account for the overwhelming longevity and popularity of the carol's protagonist, Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge is one of those characters, like Hamlet, who has become detached from the story in which he had his birth, and has become instantly recognizable even by those who may never have read the book. Why should that be? Well, let me consult my own model of that favorite Dickensian repository of infallible knowledge. The human heart. When I did first meet the immortal Scrooge, and why did I become so fond of him? I seem always to have been aware of him. Did I hear a Christmas carol read on the radio during my 1940s childhood? Oh, it's likely. Those were the radio days. Or did I encounter him the way I encountered so much else, peering out with sly and narrow but nonetheless twinkling eyes from the colorful ads in magazines? In this respect, Scrooge was a sort of anti-Santa Claus. Oh, you know, Santa Claus's dark twin. The one, fat and jolly and round and red, dispensing largesse. The other, skinny and pinched and dour with holding it. Yet at the end of Carol, the new redeemed turkey-purchasing Bob Cratchit salary-raging Scrooge has become a sort of Santa, which raises the chilling possibility that Santa might one day shrivel and wizen and morph into Scrooge at his worst. That crabby geezer in the opening chapter of the book. Consider those punitive Satian lumps of coal, not much mentioned in these days, but kept, you can bet, in Santa's worst-case reserve arsenal of dirty tricks. Coal in your stocking would be just what the mean version of Scrooge would have liked. Whatever the case, by the time my 7-year-old self discovered Disney's Scrooge McDuck, I knew quite well what the name Scrooge was supposed to signify. It included the fact that within McDuck's ancient scheming husk there flickered a kindly and generous impulse. It was a good sign that the Duck triplets adored their Uncle Scrooge. He was a lot of fun because, in recreational moments, he often behaved just as childishly as they did themselves. This is one key to the original Ebenezer Scrooge. He's a child at heart, but when we first meet him in A Christmas Carol, he's a wounded child, albeit an elderly one. In writing Scrooge, Dickens delved deep within and put a good measure of his own hidden pain into his creation. He'd never forgotten the most hopeless period of his life, when his feckless father had been locked into debtor's prison, and young Charles had been wrenched from school and set to work in a blacking factory to help support the destitute Dickens family. This period did not last forever, but for a child, the present moment is forever. The young Dickens could see no possibility of rescue from the unfamiliar hell into which his father's financial mistrust had thrust him. The most poignant moment in A Christmas Carol is not the death of Tiny Tim, weep-making though that is, nor is it the plangent picture of Scrooge's own possible future corpse, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for. The objective mind might comment that it doesn't much matter to a corpse what sort of outfit it's wearing or who is standing around it, though it mattered a lot to Dickens. No, the most sniffle-making scene is the first picture of the spirit of Christmas past shows to Scrooge. His young boy, a solitary child, abandoned by his friends, at a cheerless run-down boarding school while everyone else has gone home to Christmas. Luckily, this child Scrooge does have some friends, but they are imaginary ones. They exist only in books. However, by the next picture, several years later, even these friends have gone, and despair has taken their place. To be alone, to be a helpless child, neglected and forgotten in a dreary place, such as the Dickensian nightmare acted out by this Scrooge. It's this, not the arrival of Scrooge's sister Fan to take him home from school, nor the happy dancing and capering that goes on during Scrooge's apprentice years at Mr. Fezziwig's, that sets the miserly part of Scrooge on the which drove him to work himself into a frenzy in order to make more money, and the desire to exercise himself, the generosity that would have saved his child self from blackening factory, had anyone turned up with some of it then. In many of his fictions, Dickens is fond of arranging characters in pairs. The lookalikes, Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton of A Tale of Two Cities, are the most obvious examples. The virtuous idealist versus the cynic and wastrel. We find such arrangements melodramatic. Heroes and villains no longer convince us. However, in Ebenezer Scrooge, Dickens melds the two opposites into one. Being neither hero nor villain, Scrooge is both, and also an individual whose conflicts we can understand. Perhaps this is the clue to Scrooge's long life, and to the popularity he still enjoys. With Scrooge, we don't have to choose. Not only that, the two halves of Scrooge correspond to our own two money-related impulses. Rake in the cash and keep it all for yourself, or share with others. With Scrooge, we can vicariously do both. There's yet another of those young Dickens hapless child's avatars in Christmas Carol, Tiny Tim. Some people find wee Tim far too cloying to take straight. He's so infernally good. But when the Victorians said, "Oh, he's too good for this world," which they often did, the kind of goodness they intended was a passivity due to illness. Such children usually died early. Having already written The Death of Little Nell in the Old Curiosity Shop, to international mass wailing, and according to Dickens, with the tears coursing down his cheek as he polished her off, Dickens was well up to the pathos needed for the shorter and more indirect dispatch of Tim. But Tim is a boy who can be rescued, as Scrooge was not, or not until it was rather too late. And Scrooge himself can do the rescuing. He can perform for Tim the act of generosity that would once have saved his child self. He can become a second father, the benevolent, competent, and financially sound father figure Dickens himself never had, and that he so frequently invented. At the end of A Christmas Carol, when all three spirits have come and gone, Scrooge has had a good, repentant cry. Oh, always a positive sign in the Dickensian world. And Christmas morning has dawned, and the bells are ringing, and Scrooge has discovered he isn't dead after all. He declares that he is not only as happy as an angel, he's also merry as a schoolboy. Now, which schoolboy might that be? Certainly not the one Scrooge himself was, left alone and abandoned and despairing in the chilly, dank school of his youth. Rather the merry schoolboy he ought to have been, and that he can now vicariously be through Tim. Our age is one that avoids mention of the salvation of souls, preferring to speak instead of delayed mastery and the healing process. Perhaps this is how we can best make sense of Scrooge. But whatever the terms of our interpretation, Scrooge has passed the only real test for a literary character. He remains fresh and vital. Scrooge lives, we might write on our T-shirts. Yes, he does. And we rejoice with him. And so, Friday comes to a close with a touch of Scrooge, a touch of Trump, and a world of observations.